Be me, Mitch, 34 years old, geologist for an oil and gas company. Not a desk job, not a lab coat situation. 3 weeks on site, 1 week home. Repeat that cycle for 8 years. The fieldwork is exactly what it sounds like. You live in trailers, you eat whatever the camp cook made, you read sediment logs at midnight under fluorescent lights. The job pays well because nobody wants to do it, and it takes years of school to understand what you're looking at. Most people from my hometown have no idea what a geologist actually does on an oil field. They think I walk around with a rock hammer pointing at cliffs. The reality is a lot of data, a lot of maps, a lot of disagreements with engineers about formation pressure and drill targets. When you're in the field, you wake up early, you're outside in whatever the weather is doing. You document everything and check it twice. There's no real clock out. If something needs to be looked at, it gets looked at, even at 2 in the morning. The schedule is brutal the first couple of years until you get used to it. After that, it's just the rhythm of how you live. Been doing it since I was 26. 8 years in now. I'm good at the job, and the job is mostly what my life consists of. Drive a 2009 F-15, with about 180,000 miles on it. Runs fine, maintained consistently, no reason to replace it. Apartment is a 2-bedroom in a decent part of town, nothing flashy. I rent because buying something I'm only physically present in for a week out of every 4 never made much sense to me. Neighbors are mostly working people, normal neighborhood. Not the kind of exterior that signals anything particular about finances. That's always been fine. Never cared much about the visible surface of my life being impressive to anyone. What I cared about was the part of my finances that wasn't visible. Started putting money into index funds when I was 23, before finishing school. A personal finance book I picked up during a slow semester got me going. Nothing sophisticated at first, just broad market funds and let time do the work. Moved more into individual energy sector stocks once I was actually working in the field and understood the industry from the inside. It's not insider trading or anything like that. Just context. When you understand what formation a company is drilling into, and you know the geology of that basin, you're not making blind bets. You're making informed decisions based on technical knowledge you spent years acquiring. I did well with that over time, consistently. Not spectacularly, but consistently. The rotation schedule actually helped with investing in a way that had nothing to do with discipline or virtue. When you're in the field for 3 weeks, you can't do anything impulsive with money. No bar to run up a tab at, no weekend trip to book on a whim, no mall to walk through. The money just sat in the accounts and did what money does when it sits still. Contributed to my 401k from the very first paycheck at my first real job. Never missed a contribution. Always maxed the employer match, left it alone, and let it compound without watching it constantly. In my late 20s, a coworker and friend I'd known for a few years decided to start his own small drilling company. Private operation, the kind that picks up service contracts from larger companies who don't want to run their own equipment and crews for certain jobs. He went around to a few of us who'd been in the industry long enough to understand what he was building. I put in a serious amount of money. He structured it as an LLC, with a small group of us listed as operational partners. The operating agreement was written by an actual attorney, not a template. Included transfer restrictions because that's standard and smart for a small private company. You don't want one of your partners deciding to sell their stake to some outside party the rest of you have never met. Years went by. The company found its footing, landed consistent contracts, ran well. My stake grew from the original investment into something worth considerably more on paper. Also had a cold crypto wallet. Accumulated those coins during a slow stretch on rotation when the price was at a point that felt manageable and worth the small bet. Bought, moved to cold storage, didn't touch it or check it compulsively. Not a trader, just bought and held and didn't think about it for long stretches. Nobody knew about any of this in detailed numbers. Not because I was concealing it. It just never came up the way that kind of thing usually doesn't in normal conversations. If someone at a work barbecue asks what you do and you say geologist on oil fields, they nod and ask if the travel gets old. Nobody asks for a breakdown of your investment accounts. And I didn't volunteer one because it never seemed relevant to bring up unprompted. Tiffany definitely didn't know the specifics. She saw the apartment and the truck and the rotation schedule and built a picture of me in her head. Stable technical job, responsible with money, probably setting aside a decent amount, nothing spectacular, which is a fair interpretation of what the visible surface showed. She just didn't know what was under the surface, and since she'd never asked a specific question about my accounts or investments, I'd never given a specific breakdown. That was the natural state of things between us. Met Tiffany at a birthday party for a mutual acquaintance, someone I'd known loosely through the city. Tiffany knew from her professional circle. She worked as an assistant producer at a regional TV station, not a top market, but not a small local operation either. One of those mid-sized city stations with actual resources, but without the prestige of the major markets. She was the kind of person who takes up a certain amount of space in a room without appearing to try. Loud in a way that's genuinely charming when you first encounter it. Already knew half the people at the party and was in the process of knowing the other half. Attractive in a way that was mostly about energy and how she moved through a space. Dark hair, always well put together, comfortable being the one who was talking. We ended up in the same corner of the party and talked for most of the night. I gave her my number when people started leaving. She texted first the next morning, which I appreciated. We started seeing each other. She'd come over when I was back from rotation. Sometimes I'd take her out. Sometimes we'd cook at her place or mine. Not expensive restaurants every time, just normal going-out behavior that two adults do. I paid more often than not. She didn't make a thing of it, didn't argue about it, just let it be what it was most of the time. The early months had that good energy where everything is still fresh and you're finding out who the person actually is. She was funny in a specific way, quick with a reference, good at reading a room. She worked hard at her job and cared about the work, even if the industry was difficult. She'd tell me about the producers above her, the ones who gave credit where it wasn't deserved and took it where it was. I'd hear about a segment that had been her idea from the beginning that got pitched by someone else in the room. She was bothered by that stuff, but not in a way that took over the whole conversation, just venting, which is normal when you're trying to move up in a competitive industry. Her job was the kind where proximity to the camera matters, even if you're nowhere near it. Assistant producer is a real job with real hours, but it's also a waiting room for the next thing if you're ambitious. I didn't know much about how television worked, and she seemed to find that refreshing, someone who didn't have opinions about her industry. We got along well in those first months. She'd ask about the field work and actually listen to the answers. I'd hear about her week and find it genuinely interesting because it was so different from what I did. Two completely different work worlds that didn't overlap at all, which made conversation easy. Early on, she complained a couple times about the schedule, specifically about the 3 weeks away part, the long stretches of short texts, and the week home that never felt like enough. I explained it every time. Told her this is the job, the rotation isn't adjustable, it's not going to change. If that's a deal breaker, then better to understand that now. She said she understood and seemed to mean it. Took that at face value. The feminist framework was there from the beginning of the relationship. Not in a confrontational daily way, more like a default lens she applied to things as they came up. She'd say things about accountability, about power dynamics, about how systems were set up and who benefited from them. I'd nod and keep eating. It wasn't something I wanted to get into over dinner. She worked in television, spent her days around a particular professional culture where those ideas were just how people talked and thought. Her colleagues operated in the same register. Her close friends were even more concentrated in it. It was her water, and she swam in it naturally without seeming to notice it was water at all. She'd sometimes make a point and look at me to see how I'd respond. I generally didn't respond strongly in either direction. She seemed to find that either reassuring or slightly unsatisfying depending on the day. I had opinions about things I knew well, geology and energy markets, and how to read a formation. The social commentary stuff didn't produce strong reactions in me, and I wasn't performing neutral. I was just actually neutral. She took that as evidence I wasn't defensive, which I appreciated. After about 8 months, we went to a work function of mine, one of those company events with too much food and a forced family atmosphere. A number of my coworkers had partners who either didn't work or had part-time arrangements. That tends to happen in rotation-heavy industries because it's logistically easier when someone is consistently home. Nobody pushed that arrangement on anyone. It just worked out that way for several couples over time. On the drive home, Tiffany made a comment about not wanting to end up like those women. I told her clearly that nobody was asking her to become anything she didn't want to be. She seemed satisfied and let it go. The relationship stayed mostly solid through the rest of that year and into the next. No fights about anything significant. The usual small friction of two people building shared time around an irregular schedule. She had her world, her colleagues, her close friend group, the apartment she'd bought a few years before we met. I had mine. The arrangement was parallel lives that intersected a few days per month and built into something real over time. Around the 2-year mark, I started thinking about proposing. Not an emotional lightning bolt moment, more of a slow, practical conclusion that arrived over a few weeks. I liked her. We'd stayed good together past the point where novelty could carry it. She was clearly invested in where things were going. That combination doesn't appear constantly. I bought a ring. Decent stone, clean, classic setting, not trying to make a statement. Proposed at home one evening. No restaurant, no stage production, no photographer hiding behind a bush. Just the two of us in the apartment. She said yes immediately and started crying. Then called 3 different friends before I'd gotten all the way up from where I was sitting. Sat on the couch listening to her tell the same story 3 times in 30 minutes to 3 different people. That was fine. I expected something in that neighborhood. The weeks after that were normal engagement territory, telling parents, getting congratulated by people, fielding questions about venues and dates. Her mom called me directly for the first time and was warm and a little emotional. My mom cried for a minute and then asked me to go through every detail again from the beginning. Standard family behavior all around. What I noticed quickly was that Tiffany's close friend group had strong opinions about essentially everything, not just the wedding logistics, but about what kind of marriage this needed to be, what protections she needed, what she was potentially sacrificing. Her core friends were all in media, or communications, or adjacent fields. Strong personalities, all of them, everyone. The feminist framework was more concentrated in that group than in Tiffany herself, actually. She was the most moderate of the bunch in practical daily terms. Her closest friend worked at a nonprofit that did media advocacy and had a lot of thoughts about how relationships reproduced systemic inequality. Another one worked in editorial and had been through a difficult divorce a couple of years earlier that had left her with a specific set of views about men and money. I'd met most of them at various points. They were pleasant enough to my face, but I could tell when Tiffany came back from spending time with them that the conversations had a particular energy. A certain amount of processing and reframing got applied to the relationship when I wasn't in the room. One of those friends made a comment at a dinner I wasn't at, Tiffany mentioned it later. Something about making sure she protected herself going into this. That she was in prime earning years and needed to think carefully about what legal commitments could cost her professionally and financially. I thought that was an odd way to frame marrying someone you'd chosen after 2 years together, but didn't say anything about it. A couple weeks later, Tiffany brought up the prenup. We were home on a regular evening. She sat down across from me with a very particular posture, deliberate and prepared, like she'd rehearsed the first sentence a few times. Said she'd been thinking, and she wanted a prenuptial agreement. The terms she had in mind were 50-50 on everything. Equal split of all assets in a divorce. Full financial disclosure from both parties required before signing anything. Everything transparent, same exposure on both sides. Nobody gets to take advantage. She laid this out calmly. I could tell she'd been expecting some form of pushback. Maybe she expected a flat no and had arguments ready for that. Maybe she expected me to want to negotiate the terms, and she had counterpositions loaded. I looked at her for a second and said okay. She blinked. Asked if I was sure about that. Told her yes, 50-50 sounds reasonable. Get a lawyer and let's draw it up correctly. She asked again in a slightly different way whether I genuinely had no problem with those specific terms. I said I didn't. Let's move forward. She accepted that eventually and got the process started. Hired an attorney through a recommendation from one of her friends. Young woman, family law specialty. Tiffany said she seemed sharp. I found my own attorney through a separate channel. Older man, estate and contract law for decades. The kind of lawyer who has seen every variation of every situation and doesn't spend words on things that don't need saying. We met and I explained the request. 50-50 split on all assets at dissolution, full financial disclosure required from both parties beforehand. He wrote it down and didn't add commentary. Asked whether I wanted any protective language, any specific carve-outs beyond the basic structure. I told him to make sure the LLC was accurately represented according to its actual legal structure, and that all my assets were disclosed completely and correctly for what they actually were. That was all I said. He said he'd handle it, and we wrapped up. The weeks that followed, I was mostly back on rotation. Tiffany handled the wedding planning from her end. She'd text me venue photos while I was in the field. I'd respond with preferences. Her mom and my mom had both gotten involved by then, which meant a steady stream of group texts about catering and guest lists and seating arrangements. Tiffany seemed happy during that stretch, genuinely engaged in all of it, which was good to see. There were moments on the phone during those weeks where she sounded like herself again and not like someone running a calculation. The prenup was one item on a long checklist, nothing more significant than the other items on that list from where I sat. I didn't think much about it between the lawyers being in communication. At some point, my attorney put together the full disclosure package. We documented everything properly, checking account balance at the time of filing, the F150 year mileage, estimated current market value, the 401k balance, compounding since I was 22, sitting at a significant number by this point. The investment portfolio broken down by holdings and approximate current valuation. The crypto cold wallet valued at the specific date of disclosure. The LLC stake with the full operating agreement attached, including the specific clause designating me as a non-transferable operational partner and what that meant for any transfer or division of the interest. Everything accurate, everything included, nothing left out. I remember looking at the documents before they went out. Just a stack of papers with numbers on them. Nothing I'd hidden, nothing I'd obscured, just years of work and time accounted for on paper. Sent the complete package to Tiffany's attorney as required under the terms she'd proposed. Didn't hear back immediately. Got home from the next rotation, and Tiffany was in a different headspace. Not upset visibly, just clearly processing something. Mentioned her lawyer had called and wanted to meet with her in person, before any signing happened, said it in a tone that made it sound like probably a formality. I said that was completely normal for something like this. She asked if there was something I hadn't told her. I said everything is in the disclosure. Every account and asset is listed accurately. She went quiet, and we left the conversation there for that evening. The meeting with her attorney happened a few days later. I wasn't there. Each side has their own counsel for a reason. Tiffany called me after it was over. The call started normally, and then the tone shifted about 2 minutes in. She started asking about the LLC. I explained what it was. A private drilling company that a colleague and friend had started years before I had ever met Tiffany. I'd put money in early when he was getting it started. It turned into an equity stake over time as the company grew. She asked why it wasn't going to be split under the prenup. I walked through the operating agreement. I was listed as a non-transferable operational partner. The structure of the LLC doesn't allow that kind of partnership interest to be cleanly divided the way a bank account or a stock position can be divided. You can't hand someone half of a non-transferable operational partnership without dissolving the agreement entirely. Dissolving my stake would also affect the other partners, people who had nothing to do with our situation and hadn't agreed to any of it. It wasn't a technicality I was hiding behind. It was just the actual legal and structural reality of how the company was set up. She said that seemed convenient. I said the company was structured that way years before I met her, years before any prenup was being considered, before the engagement was even a thought in either of our heads. The transfer restrictions were in the original founding documents because that's how you protect a small private company. She said she'd talk more in person and got off the call. That evening, she sat down and walked me through what her attorney had laid out for her. The 401k, sitting at roughly $180,000, is protected under federal retirement account law and doesn't divide in a prenuptial agreement the way a standard asset does. The investment portfolio, which she hadn't known the specific number on before the disclosure, came to approximately $340,000 at the valuation date. She said that number clearly, out loud, and let it sit in the air between us for a moment. The crypto wallet had been valued at around $90,000 on the disclosure date. The LLC stake couldn't be treated as divisible liquid property under the prenup as written, given the operating agreement structure. What remained as actually splittable property under the terms she'd proposed was the checking account and the truck. Together, those came to about $20,000. 50% was $10,000. Then her own numbers. Equity in the apartment. 5 years of payments. Roughly a third of the mortgage down. Equity near $65,000. Her car, almost fully paid off. Market value, around $14,000. Savings account, $18,000. Total divisible assets on her side, approximately $97,000. 50% was close to $48,500. Under the prenup, she had proposed and written and retained a lawyer to draft. In a divorce scenario, she would owe him $48,500. He would owe her $10,000. Net outcome, she'd be writing a check, not receiving one. She sat across from me after laying all of that out and said this was not what she meant when she asked for 50-50. I asked her what she meant then. She said equal, fair, the same risk on both sides. I said that was what the document said. She said I knew what the outcome would look like given my financial structure, and I agreed to the terms without explaining what the math actually meant. I asked her when I should have explained that. We'd been together 2 years, and not once had she asked a specific question about my portfolio or my retirement account or any investment I was holding. It wasn't hidden. There were no locked files, no accounts at separate institutions I hadn't mentioned. It just hadn't come up in specific terms, the same way her apartment equity and savings balance hadn't come up in specific terms from her side of things. She said it was different. I asked how. She didn't give me a clean answer. Shifted into a broader point about men and financial structures, and how the whole system made this outcome predictable for men and invisible to women until too late. I said I opened a brokerage account at 23 and contributed to it over 8 years of working rotations with limited expenses and limited things to spend money on in the field. There's no conspiracy in compound interest. She said the LLC was the sticking point, that a business interest structured to be non-transferable looked specifically designed to protect itself from exactly this kind of situation. I offered to show her the original incorporation documents. The founding date was years before Tiffany and I had ever had a conversation. The transfer restrictions appear in the first version of the operating agreement, not added after the engagement, not changed since the ring. She moved off that, said the whole prenup had been a setup from the start. I told her she had proposed it, she had set the conditions, she had hired the lawyer, she had required the disclosure, all of which I had agreed to and complied with completely. She said I knew what the outcome would be when I agreed to it. I said yes. I understood what 50-50 of my divisible assets looked like relative to 50-50 of hers. I agreed because those were her terms, and they were reasonable terms, and I had nothing to keep out of sight. She asked why I didn't explain the math to her before agreeing. I sat with that question. It was the one that had the most actual weight to it. Told her the conversation about both of our financial pictures was available before the lawyers got involved. She could have asked me to walk through our respective situations before proposing the structure. That conversation would have taken about 30 minutes and answered everything. She said it wasn't fair to put the burden of asking the right questions on her when I already had all the information. I said every person in a relationship has financial details their partner doesn't have in full until they share them. The disclosure requirement was her mechanism for making that information visible. It worked precisely the way it was supposed to work. She went into the hallway with her phone. I heard her talking to one of her friends. Couldn't make out most of it, but the word manipulative came through clearly more than once. Also heard something about toxic financial behavior. When she came back, she said she wasn't signing the prenup under those terms. Wanted everything renegotiated from scratch. The portfolio included as a divisible asset, the LLC, somehow factored in, regardless of the operating agreement technicalities, the terms rewritten to reflect what she'd actually intended. I said if she wanted to start over completely, I was open to it. But I wasn't going to dissolve my operational partnership in a functioning company with other partners who have nothing to do with our relationship. That company has employees, service contracts, ongoing obligations to other people. It can't be unwound to satisfy a clause in a prenup. She said then maybe there should be no prenup at all. I said that was her call. The days after that were tense in a steady, low-grade way. She'd bring it up at different moments, in the kitchen in the morning, during dinner, while getting ready for something. Kept coming back to the portfolio, asking in slightly varied ways each time why she hadn't known about it. I kept giving the same answer. It wasn't something I brought up because there was no particular reason to bring it up unprompted. The same way she hadn't given me a detailed account of her apartment equity over wine. She started using the word secretive. I used the word private back. One of her friends offered a framework involving financial opacity as a documented pattern in men with certain relationship styles. Tiffany repeated this to me with the tone of someone presenting findings from a study. I said I had been willing to answer any financial question she'd ever asked. Not one such question had been asked in 2 years, and everything was now fully visible because she'd required disclosure through her own process. She said that framing made her the problem. I said it made her someone who now had all the information she'd asked for. There were a few days in there that were exhausting in a quiet way. Not explosive, not dramatic, just the same loop running again and again with slightly different wording. I'd come home from wherever, and she'd be in a certain mood, and I knew within about 30 seconds which direction the evening was going. The friends were in her ear a lot during that period. She'd mention things they'd said, framings they'd offered, articles they'd apparently shared in a group chat. One of them had found something about how men in skilled trades and technical jobs disproportionately hold financial information in relationships. It was presented to me as a statistic, not a conversation. I said that might be true generally and had nothing specific to do with us. She said patterns are patterns. I stopped engaging with the indirect arguments after a while, just listened and let her finish, and then said the same thing I'd been saying. Her attorney told her at some point, when she called for another consultation, that the default legal framework in our state would still treat most of my assets as separate property, even without a prenup. The LLC investment predated the relationship by years. So did most of the portfolio. The 401k has federal protections that don't depend on a prenup at all. What she'd realistically receive in an uncontested divorce without any prenup would come out roughly similar to what the prenup math was already showing her. The prenup she'd proposed was, functionally, close to the default legal outcome anyway. Coming home after hearing that, her energy had changed. She said her friends had a collective read on the situation, that I had engineered the whole thing to create the appearance of fairness while keeping complete financial control at every stage, that agreeing to terms, the other person doesn't fully understand, and then acting cooperative while the outcome unfolds was a recognized pattern. She said the word control a few times. Also, the word toxic came up. I let her finish. Then said I'm a geologist who has been depositing money into accounts over 8 years of working difficult jobs in difficult conditions and not spending what I earned. I didn't build a control architecture. I just didn't blow through my salary. She said intent didn't matter as much as outcome. I asked what specifically the outcome was. She said the outcome was that she was significantly more financially exposed in this marriage than I was, and that it would only widen over time. I told her that if the relationship had become primarily a risk-exposure calculation, I didn't know how to address that. Not because I didn't care about how she felt, but because there was no way to reconstruct 8 years of savings history to make the numbers land differently. She looked at me and said she'd been asking herself whether she actually wanted to go through with the wedding. I said then, take the time to answer that question properly. Don't rush it. She said she'd already been sitting with it for a couple of weeks. That was news to me, but I didn't say anything about it. Just told her again to make whatever decision was right for her. I was tired of the loop we'd been in and wanted her to land somewhere that made sense, wherever that was. She left that evening to stay with a friend, carried her things out quietly, no scene. I helped with a box to her car. She drove off. I went back inside and sat in the apartment for a while without turning anything on. The ring was on the coffee table. I picked it up and put it in the drawer with the takeout menus and some batteries I'd never used. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it gets when something that was part of the space isn't anymore. Her things had mostly been here and there, nothing major, but their absence had a texture. A spot on the counter where her bag had usually been, a show in the queue she'd wanted us to watch together, a small plant she'd brought over that I now had to figure out how to keep alive. I watered the plant, figured that was the least I could do. A week or so after that, she sent a text, said she'd thought it through and didn't think she could move forward with the engagement, that she needed to build a life with someone where the foundation felt genuinely equal, and she didn't feel that with me. I replied that I understood. One line, nothing more. She called a few days after, was composed, a little sad, asked if I understood her reasons. I said yes. She asked if I was angry. I said no. And that was accurate. There was no particular anger. more of a flat kind of reset, like when something you'd planned around stops being on the table and you have to recalibrate. She seemed to want me to say more, to give the conversation more weight. I didn't have more to give it. We said goodbye, and that was the last real conversation we had. Heard through the mutual acquaintance network that her version of events involved hidden assets and a deliberately constructed financial trap. Heard that one of her friends had posted something on social media about financial manipulation being an underreported form of control in relationships. I don't have social media, so this came to me secondhand. A few people from the mutual circle reached out over the following weeks. Most of them kept it vague and loose, the standard check-in that doesn't actually ask anything. One woman I'd met a few times through Tiffany sent a message that had the energy of someone who'd heard one side and was doing due diligence. I gave her a brief version of what happened and said I wished Tiffany well. She said that was very mature of me, which felt like a verdict being delivered. I thanked her and left it. One guy I'd met a handful of times at group events texted and said plainly that it seemed like she asked for exactly what she got, and he was sorry it went that way. That was the most accurate thing anyone said. I thanked him and left it. The apartment was quiet in a specific way after she stopped being part of it. Not the quiet of being on rotation, where she's just elsewhere living her life. A different kind of quiet. I found myself noticing where her things had been for a few days. The spot on the counter where she kept her work bag, the shows queued up on the streaming service we'd shared a login for, that kind of thing. After a week or two, it just became the apartment again, and not a before and after version of it. I called my mom once during that period, told her it hadn't worked out, kept it general. She asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said not really. She said okay, and we talked about something else. My dad texted separately and said sometimes these things just don't work, and that was it. I appreciated the brevity. Went back on rotation. The work doesn't adjust for what's happening in your personal life. You show up, you read the geology, you document what's there. Trailers are the same, the cook is the same, the maps are the same. The crew doesn't ask questions about your home life if you don't bring it up. I didn't bring it up. There's something genuinely useful about a job that completely occupies you for stretches. You don't have a lot of space to sit with whatever you're processing because there's always something that needs to be checked or verified or argued about with an engineer who thinks they know more about the formation than you do. By the third or fourth day back in the field, the apartment and the ring in the kitchen drawer felt appropriately distant. Not gone, just appropriately distant. The portfolio had a decent quarter. The LLC picked up a new service contract. My friend texted to let me know. The 401k moved up in line with the broader market. Cold wallet still untouched in storage. Truck still running. Got the oil change before I left. Life is quiet in the specific way it gets quiet when something you expected to be there isn't anymore. I'm not angry at her. Don't think she's a bad person. I think she wanted something to look equal, and when it didn't look the way she'd imagined it would, she reached for the explanation her friends had available. That explanation required me to be the problem. It's a cleaner story than the actual one, which is just that two people had different financial starting points, and the numbers reflected that when she asked for them to be put on paper. Nobody engineered anything. The numbers were just what they were. What I keep coming back to is simple. She built the entire structure herself. She proposed the prenup. She set the terms. She required the disclosure. She hired the lawyer. At every step, she was the one deciding how the process would work. When the disclosure came back showing what I actually had, the issue in her version wasn't that I'd lied or falsified anything. It was that I hadn't mentioned it over dinner at some point in 2 years. Apparently not volunteering your investment portfolio in casual conversation is the same as hiding it now. I genuinely don't know when that became the standard. She asked for 50-50 and got exactly 50-50. The math just didn't divide the way she'd pictured it in her head when she proposed the idea. I agreed to what she asked for and got called manipulative for complying. That's the whole story. Going back on rotation in a few days. Truck needs an oil change before I leave. The plant is still alive, for what it's worth.